Hey, Granny, you got something to say?
You're a crank. You're a crank. Poopy is a crank.
What are you talking about? I never knew you was talking about.
You're a crank. Now you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I actually don't know what a crank is, so...
Poopy.
I don't know what a crank
Poopy.
is. But I know who is a... I know who is a crank, and it's me, but I don't know what a crank is.
You a crank.
I know I'm a crank, but I don't know what a crank is, but I know I'm a crank. That's the only thing I know.
So you around here calling people cranks and you don't know what it is.
Well, you just called me a crank, so...
I know what a crank is.
So what is a crank then?
So all this time you've been calling people cranks and you don't know what a crank is.
Well, actually I don't, but I never seen a crank. But I don't know what a crank is. But I know I'm a crank. That's something I know.
So a crank is a crybaby sissy punk.
That's not what a crank is. Wait a minute. I know what a crank is.
What?
A crank is you ugly and you stink.
So you said you a crank.
But you told me I was a crank first, not me.
You said you knew you didn't know what a crank is, but you know you a crank. So you saying you ugly and you stink.
Well, you called me a crank first.
It doesn't matter. You still said you was a crank, and that's what you think a crank is. So that's what if you think that's what a crank is, then that's what a crank is.
Okay. What's the problem about that?
You ugly and you stink.
So, you a crank, so you ugly and you stink. So, it's the problem. You crank and you ugly and you stink.
You's a crank, Joe.
And you a crank too. And that means you ugly and you stink. Bye-bye. I don't like it anymore.